Hello students. So today's video features the concept of human respiration. Okay. Now in humans we have a perfect organ system which is meant for respiration, and that is known as the respiratory system. Okay. Now this system begins here in the nostrils, or we can say at the nasal cavity, and ends all the way to the lungs. Okay. Now let's discuss all of the parts in detail. The first part of the system is nose. Yes, it is a part of the upper respiratory system, and air enters the body through the nose. So this is the main function of our nose, that it allows the air to enter in our body. Okay. Now the nasal cavity has the presence of hairs and mucus which filter the air passing through the nostrils. Okay, so the nostrils, see, they are shown in the picture as well. These nostrils, there are two holes, or we can say there are two openings which are present on the face, and the nasal cavity opens at our face through these two openings which we call nostrils. Okay, now there are hairs and mucus which are present in the nasal cavity. As you can see in this image as well, the olfactory mucosa is labeled, right? So the function of this olfactory mucosa is to secrete mucus, and that mucus along with the hairs lines our nasal cavity, and it filters the air which enters in our body through the nostrils. Okay, the dust particles and the other impurities present in the air are trapped by the nasal hair and mucus, so that only clean air goes into the lungs. Okay, so now our mucous membrane and the hairs, they'll tend to trap the dust particles and the other foreign impurities, and it will allow only clean air to move into the lower respiratory tract, or we can say only clean air moves into the lungs. Okay, now the next part of the respiratory system is pharynx. Okay, so the pharynx, it is the part of the throat between the mouth and windpipe. Okay, and we have already discussed the parts of the pharynx in the video of digestive system, right? The parts are the nasopharynx, or which we call as the nasal pharynx, then the oral pharynx, or we call it as the oropharynx, and lastly the laryngopharynx, right? Now air enters from nasal passage to the pharynx and then goes into the windpipe, which we call as trachea. So as you can see, pharynx form a connecting link between the nasal cavity and our windpipe, that is trachea. Another important thing is, basically you can say our pharynx, it forms a point where the digestive and the respiratory system diverge. Okay. Now next we have larynx. Okay. It is also known as the voice box. Why? Let's see. When air expels from the lungs, the vocal cords close together and vibrate, producing sound. Okay, so that's how sound is produced from our mouth. As when air expels from the lungs, our vocal cords, they tend to close together and vibrate. This produce sound. So that's the reason why larynx is called as the voice box, since it is involved or it plays a role in speech. Okay. Next, we have a flap-like structure which is known as epiglottis. That is present, which prevents the food and the other particles from entering the respiratory tract. Okay, so this epiglottis, it is nothing but it is a flap-like structure which is present on the upper surface of the larynx, okay, in the upper region. And this epiglottis, it prevents the food particles and other impurities to enter into the lower respiratory system. Okay, so now you can see how our larynx performs dual role. The first is involved in the production of speech, that's why it is known as the voice box, and secondly, by preventing the food and other particles from entering the respiratory system. Okay, let's move forward now. Our next line is trachea. We also call it as a windpipe. So the trachea, it is commonly called as the windpipe, and this trachea, see, it forms the main airway to the lungs. It is the main connecting link between the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. The air enters from the nasal passage to the pharynx to the lungs through this trachea. Okay. Now this trachea, or what we call as a windpipe, it divides into the right and the left bronchi at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebra, channeling air to the right or left lung. So as you can see in this image as well, this is our windpipe, the trachea. It divides into the left and the right bronchus, okay, and this bronchus, okay. These are the part of this trachea. The trachea divides on the level of fifth thoracic vertebrae into the two bronchi, okay. Now there are two important things regarding a trachea. The first is the hyaline cartilage, okay. The hyaline cartilage in the tracheal wall prevents the trachea from collapsing. Okay, so our hyaline cartilage, it is basically a translucent, a glass-like cartilage that is meant for providing support to the tracheal wall, and it also prevents the trachea from collapsing out. Okay, the next is the mucous membrane. The mucous membrane that lines the trachea is ciliated, that traps the airborne particles and microorganisms. So again, as you can see, we had the mucous membrane in our nasal cavity. This time also we are having a mucous membrane in the tracheal region, okay? And it has a similar function of trapping the microbes and filtering the air, right? The cilia, which are present in this trachea, in the tracheal region, they will expel the mucus along with those trapped microbes out of the trachea, okay? So now you guys know how these cilia are really important for your body, right? Just try to imagine if these cilia ever get destroyed, how much damage we have to suffer, right? For example, you can take the case of smoking. See, what happens in smoking is the cilia get burned out, they get damaged, due to which they are unable to trap microbes and the dust particles. And obviously, the air is not filtered out, right? So, this ultimately leads to conditions, the health conditions like inflammation, cough, and even lung cancer. So that's why it is said that smoking is injurious to health, because it can lead to such major problems by burning our cilia out. Okay. Now moving to our next part in line, which is bronchi. Okay. So you all know that our trachea, it runs down the neck and divides on the level of fifth thoracic vertebrae into two smaller tubes called bronchi, right? Now, these bronchi, they further divide in the lungs to form a large number of still smaller tubes called as bronchioles. So, as you can see in this image, this blue region, first we have a windpipe, and this trachea, this further divides into the right bronchus and the left bronchus, and these bronchus or bronchi, the primary bronchi, this further divides into smaller tubes, which these ones, okay, the smaller ones, and these are known as bronchioles. So you can imagine a tree kind of structure where there is a main branch, okay, and the main branch then further divides into smaller branches, right? So here we have such a kind of structure where the main branch is the trachea, then comes the primary bronchus, which further divides into the secondary bronchi and the bronchioles. Okay. Now, these bronchioles, these smaller tubes, they further have some structures. Okay. Let's see what they are. These bronchioles, they have tiny pouch-like air sacs at their ends called as alveoli. So, these alveoli are nothing but they are balloon-like structures. They are kind of air sacs-like structures, and this is how they look. So, these alveoli, they are present at the ends of the bronchioles, here on the ends, okay? And the walls of the alveoli contain an extensive network of blood vessels and provide a surface where the exchange of gases can take place. Okay, so when we look at the function of these alveoli, we can say it is at the surface of this alveoli that the gaseous exchange takes place. Okay, so this is how our alveoli plays a role in gaseous exchange in the body. Okay. Now, when we talk about these bronchi and these alveolus, where are they exactly present in the body? Well, exactly in the lungs itself. So now moving to the last part of our respiratory system, which is lungs. Okay. Now there are two lungs in our body, and the two lungs which contain all the components of the bronchial tree beyond the primary bronchi occupy most of the space in the thoracic cavity. So as we know, the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity, it contains the lungs. Both of the lungs are present in the thoracic region, and these lungs, they contain all the components of the bronchial tree beyond the primary bronchi, which means the secondary bronchi and the bronchioles, as well as the alveoli. Okay. Now, the lungs, they are soft and spongy because they are mostly air spaces surrounded by the alveolar cells, and elastic connective tissue is present. Okay. So, this connective tissue which is present in the lungs, along with the air spaces which are found between the alveolar cells, they are responsible for the soft and the spongy form of lungs. Clear? Now, each lung is enclosed by a double layered membrane called pleura. Okay, so the membrane which surrounds our lungs, it is known as pleura, and there are two of these. Okay. Now what happens is, between these two pleural membrane, we have pleural fluid, which is basically a lubricant, and this pleural fluid, it ensures that the two membranes slide past each other easily during breathing. Okay. Now, as you know, we have two lungs, right? But there is a slight difference between the two. They are not alike. Okay, let's see the difference. The right lung is shorter, broader, and has a greater volume than the left lung, and it is divided into three lobes, while the left lung is longer and has two lobes. So, this is the difference between our two lungs, where the right one is shorter and the left one is longer, and the right one, when we talk about it in the context of its division, it is divided into three lobes, while our left lung, it is divided into two lobes. Okay. Now let's move on to our next topic, which is mechanism of breathing. Okay. So when we talk about breathing, it is a combined process of inspiration and expiration, and it is vital for providing oxygen to the tissues and removing carbon dioxide from the body. Okay, so when you say a single breath implies one inhalation plus one exhalation, or we can say one inspiration plus one expiration. Okay, it is a combined process of both these steps, in which these two steps, that is inspiration and expiration, they occur simultaneously. Okay. Now, in the process of inspiration and expiration, when we talk about them, two very important muscles play their role, and those muscles are diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. Okay. See, our diaphragm, it is a dome shaped muscle. Okay. And it is located just below the heart and the lungs, whereas the external intercostal muscles, they are located in between the ribs. Okay. To understand the concept and learn the role of these muscles, let's see the following images. Okay, so now, as you all know, our lungs, they are present in the thorax region, or we can say the chest region, right? So this portion, this hollow space, see the hollow space which is present, which is enclosed by the ribs and the lungs, the diaphragm and the sternum, that is known as the thoracic cavity. Okay. Next we have external intercostal muscle. Okay, so in this diagram, as you can see, the muscles which are shown in the purple color, okay, these are the external intercostal muscles. There are arrows also showing the movement. So these are the external intercostal muscles which are present in between the ribs. Okay. Next muscle we have the diaphragm. So as you can see, it is shown in the red color, the dome shaped structure which is present below the lungs. So this is the diaphragm. Okay. Now coming to the process of inhalation or inspiration, that is when we breathe the air inside our bodies, right? Let's see the role of muscles. First is our diaphragm, right? So the diaphragm, it flattens, extending the superior inferior dimension of the thoracic cavity. Okay, so now what happens is our red structure, this one, okay, it will flatten out, which increases the superior inferior dimension of our chest cavity. Okay, now what does this mean, the term superior inferior? Well, in anatomy, when we talk about these two terms, the superior and inferior, it means the upper portion and the lower portion regarding a particular thing. Okay, so when we talk about it in the thoracic cavity, when our diaphragm contracts, or we can say when it flattens out, the superior inferior dimension, that is the upper and the lower region of the chest cavity, it will increase. Okay, it will enhance in size. So we can say that the upper and the lower space of the chest cavity, that has increased, right? Now the next muscle, which are the external intercostals, they come into play. So external intercostal muscles, they lift the ribs and the sternum, extending the anterior posterior dimension of the thoracic cavity. Okay, so these muscles, they will rise and lift the ribs and the sternum. Okay, the sternum means the breastbone. Okay, and this will extend or increase the anterior posterior dimension. Anterior posterior means the front and the back space, means this region, the front and the back space. Okay, so when the external intercostal muscles will contract, like you can see in the image as well, the arrows are pointing upwards, which means the muscles are contracting. So when they will contract, they will lift the ribs up. They will lift the ribs up along with the sternum, which will increase the dimension of the thoracic cavity in the anterior posterior dimension, which means the front and the back space. Okay, so now as you can see, the size of the chest cavity has increased in the upper and the lower direction by the contraction of diaphragm, and the front and the back space region by the contraction of external intercostal muscles, right? So when we say the size has increased, it means the volume of the chest cavity has increased, right? Now our volume, it is inversely proportional to the pressure. This is known as Boyle's law. You don't need to remember it, it is just for the sake of your understanding. Okay, so now back to our topic. When we say the volume is increasing, that means the pressure will decrease, right? So when the volume of the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity will increase, this will mean that the pressure of the gas in the cavity will decrease. So as per Boyle's law, since the pressure of the air in the environment is now greater than within the lungs, air moves into the lungs down the pressure gradient. Okay, so as you can see, since our volume has increased, the volume of thoracic cavity, the pressure of the gas inside the lungs decreases. And since the pressure of the gas within the lungs is less than the pressure of the air in the environment, the air moves from the environment to the lungs. So this is what we call as inspiration or inhalation. Okay, now let's see the process of exhalation or expiration when air is expelled out. So again we have our thoracic cavity, right, and we have our external intercostals and the diaphragm. Now in this process, what will happen is the diaphragm will relax, reducing the superior inferior dimension of the thoracic cavity. So now our front and the back space, this region, the front and the back space, this region, this has reduced because our diaphragm has relaxed, or we can say our diaphragm has returned to its original dome shaped position. Okay, due to this, the upper and the lower space will decrease, right? The upper and the lower space. Next we have our external intercostal muscles. Okay, they will depress the ribs and the sternum, reducing the anterior posterior dimension of the thoracic cavity. So as you can see, this time the front and the back space, they will also get reduced. So as you can see, by the relaxation of diaphragm, the upper and the lower space, or we can say the superior inferior dimension, is reducing. And due to the relaxation of external intercostals, the front and the back space, or we can say the anterior posterior dimension of the thoracic cavity, is reducing. So the overall size, or we can say the overall volume of the chest cavity, has decreased. So again, as per Boyle's law, the volume is decreasing, so the pressure will increase now, since volume is inversely proportional to pressure, right? Therefore, since the pressure of air inside the lungs is now greater than in the external environment, this time it moves out of the lungs down the pressure gradient. So again, air will move from a region of higher concentration to lower concentration, and since its volume inside the lungs is greater than outside, so it will move out of our bodies, and this process is termed as exhalation. So this was the mechanism of breathing, the inhalation and exhalation. Okay, now it's time for some key points to be noted. So the first is, during the breathing cycle, the lungs always contain a residual volume of air to prevent them from collapsing. Okay, see, our lungs, they never get completely empty. Even after complete exhalation, they never get empty. Okay, some air still remains inside them, and that air which is remaining in the lungs after exhalation, that is known as the residual air, or we can say the residual volume. The residual volume indirectly means the left out air. Okay, and the reason behind keeping this air in our lungs is that it will prevent our lungs from collapsing out. Because if all the air gets released from our lungs, the lung tissues would stick together. Okay, like to understand it, you can imagine the case of a deflated balloon. If you want to inflate it now, it will take a lot of effort to do that, right? Because you have to blow air from the starting. But in another case, if you have a deflated balloon with a little bit of residual air or leftover air, okay, like in this one, you can inflate it by blowing a small amount of air in it with less effort, right? So this is what happens in our lungs as well. The residual air maintains a kind of balance of gases in the lungs, and it makes the process of breathing easier. Okay, now coming to our next point, which is, as you know, diffusion is meant for gaseous exchange in unicellular organisms, right? And diffusion, it is kind of sufficient to meet the oxygen requirements of unicellular organisms. But when we talk about multicellular organisms, the case is entirely different. Like, especially in the case of higher animals, since the body size of animals is large, the diffusion pressure alone cannot take care of oxygen delivery to all the parts of the body. It is because diffusion is a very slow process. Okay, so now for the transport of the gases, okay, transport of the oxygen, we have respiratory pigment in our body, which is hemoglobin, and it is present in the red blood corpuscles. And this hemoglobin, it takes up oxygen from the air in the lungs and carry it to oxygen deficient tissues. Whereas when we talk about the carbon dioxide, it is more soluble in blood in comparison to oxygen. So it is carried or transported in the dissolved form in the plasma. Okay, so our blood has this red pigment, hemoglobin, which is responsible for the transport of oxygen, and it's not by diffusion. In our body, diffusion doesn't occur for the transport. See, it's a fact that if diffusion was to carry out gaseous transport in humans, it would nearly take about 3 years to move a single molecule of oxygen to our toes. So I guess we should be really grateful, no, that we have such a pigment in our bodies, isn't it? So that's why we have hemoglobin for transport of oxygen. Okay, so here I end my lesson for today. Thank you.